Hello folks and welcome to another SACPA session. SACPA acknowledges that this event takes place on the lands of the Blackfoot people in the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3, and we pay respect to their past, present and future cultural heritage, beliefs and relationships to the land. SACPA is very thankful for the continuing support we receive from the Lethbridge Herald, the University of Lethbridge and Shaw Spotlight. Today we're very happy to have with us Ibrahim Turay. Ibrahim, and let me just change the screen name. There we go. Ibrahim Turay is a full-time faculty in the School of Justice Studies at the Lethbridge College and a Ph.D. candidate in cultural, social and political thought at the University of Lethbridge. He has a Master's of Arts in Criminal Justice from the University of Alberta, with 11 years of experience working for Alberta Justice and Solicitor General, Correctional Services Division as a Correctional Probations and Senior Probation Officer. Ibrahim's specialty is in counter storytelling as a critical race theory methodology. His professional interests include Black youth police interactions, racialization, racial profiling, marginalization, youth gangs, and corrections. Ibrahim, thanks so much for joining us today. And I'm certainly very much looking forward to your talk, and I'm sure everybody online is as well.
Thank you very much, Annalise. I do appreciate the opportunity for me to be here today. Thanks for that warm introduction, and I look forward to the presentation myself. If you can go to the next slide for me on the objectives, please.
Yes.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here today. So today I just wanted to kind of touch on three things. But I wanted us to explore what does race mean and why does race matter at all if we're talking about marginalization within our society. I wanted to also talk a little bit about what critical race theory is and the claims that critical race theories are making as part of their research. I identify myself as a critical race theorist in the making to follow the full step of those that founded this theoretical perspective in the 1980s from the United States. I wanted also to talk about how the counter storytelling challenges majoritarian narratives within our own society. Next slide, please. So what is race? We know that race is a central concept that is play a part in the subordination of Black peoples in Canada and the United States, yet we don't always hear about race, especially when we're doing research in our societies. So what is race? For me, I think we know that race is not biological, at least from the work of Stewart Hall in Race, the Floating Signifier, where he discusses this concept of race, where the attempt to identify differences from a scientific perspective has failed. And so for me, I see race as a social construct, just as most of critical race theories have seen it as a social construct, but it doesn't necessarily mean that race doesn't exist, because we know race play a part. That's race, the skin color, and other features that we attach on to individuals within our society play a part on the experiences of those people. And so whether you identify as a Black person, a brown, red, or yellow, race actually, we know it does impact the type of experiences that members of those communities, the ones that we identified as Black or brown or yellow, do experience within society. For instance, suppose barbarism, criminality, thuggery, among other attributes, are believed to be a natural tendency of Blackness, being Black. In that case, we can infer what a Black person is going to do when we interact with a Black person. So that's what I meant by saying, although we can say race is a social construct, I want us to also know it is real in terms of its impact on those that we identified as Black or yellow or brown. Next slide, please. So what is critical race theory? We've heard a lot about critical race theory in the media of late, coming from the United States and so on. Of course, this is a theoretical perspective that started in the United States in the 1980s, started by African American and other racialized people of color from that country. So critical race theory for me is a theoretical approach that centralizes race and racism in analyzing laws, policies, and standard operating procedures of various societal institutions. These institutions can include the legal system itself. And in there, we can look at the police, the court system, and the correctional system. So from the legal system to the child welfare system that we have in our country today, we can examine those policies and see the intersection of race and how race informs some of those policies that we have in these institutions, especially when we explore them from the experiences of people of color and other marginalized individuals within our society. So this points to something that is important, that is a very important aspect from a critical race theory perspective. That when we talk about racism and the experience of racism, racism is not, from a critical race perspective, it's not something that is just based on an individual bias or an individual prejudice against somebody, but rather it is seen as a practice that is embedded within the policies of those institutions that we are seeing there. So when we look at policies within the child welfare system, you may see that perhaps we have a practice of a best way of parenting that is informed by a Western view of what it means to be a parent. When we explore racism and racial experience within the school system, we can see how students of color experience their experience within the school system happens on a day-by-day basis. We can also see the experiences of Black people from their interactions with police. We can also see the outcomes of the court system from people of color and other marginalized society in their interactions with the court system and corrections as well. So sometimes we just have to see the numbers of who is overly represented in our court system, who is overly represented in our prison and so on. Who is overly represented in terms of the kids that we have on care and all those practices. And so for critical race theorists, so if we take that definition as critical race theory, that a theory or a theoretical approach that centralizes the experiences of racism and racial discrimination within those agencies, we can see some of the claims that critical race theories are making. The first one from the work of Dequer Gombe, Chapman, and Schultz in their work Understanding Critical Race Theory, Critical Race Research Methodologies, Lessons from the Field. There are a number of claims that were identified there that related to critical race theory. First, race and racism continue to influence laws, policies, relationships, and practices within society. We also know race and racism intersect with other forms of subordination to determine the life outcomes of others within our society. We can see critical race theory challenges a society's perceived colorblindness, objectivity, meritocracy, and Mediterranean perspective in general. We can also see critical race theories challenge and propose that racism is a daily experience of people of color within our society. And so the voices of those that are marginalized, especially of Black people, to critical race theory is important. We need to hear from people with lived experience to talk about their experiences. And so their stories are considered as data, not just anecdotes. And so the person that tells a story from a critical race theories, that person is important from a critical race theories perspective. We can also see critical race theories promoting an interdisciplinary, intersectional approach for us to understand racism and how to address racism within society. And that when we look at the experiences of racism from a historical perspective, that may not give us a full picture without including economic experiences, without including even science, where science has been used in the past to justify why we should see a Black person and a white person to be different in that. So, and a critical claim too for critical race theory is that race it's not scientific. It is not scientific. It is not biological. It is a social construct, but nonetheless, it does have a real impact on those individuals. that we identify as Black or otherwise within our own society. And so critical race theorists are committed to social justice as a form of a liberatory approach, transformative and emancipatory theory, with the primary objective to end racial and other forms of oppression through systemic changes. So we have to examine the policies that we have. We have to examine the policies that we have within our own institutions and change those, because racism, it's not an individual practice, but one that is embedded within the policies of the criminal justice system and other institutions within our own society. Next slide, please. So one of the founders of critical race theory, Kimberly Crenshaw, whom I've had the opportunity to be on one of her programs and talks that she moderated. And so for her, she talks about this, she brought in this idea of intersectionality for us to be able to actually understand, to see how oppression often happens. That is not, if we pay attention to only the experiences of individuals within society from a perspective of race, we're more likely going to miss the experiences of others, even though they identify as, say, Black women, for instance, that gender plays a part within their own oppressions and so on. So Crenshaw proposes this idea in the 1980s and in the early 90s of taking an intersectional approach for us to understand. So she also realized that although we can say critical race theory is one that is attractive to people of color, including Black people, but she also understands that critical race theorists themselves are not united, because they all explore different areas of subordination within society, being patriarchy, heteronormative approach to society, and so on, racial issues, and so they explore the areas of subordination from a different perspective. But she believes that the principle, the fundamental themes that bind all critical race theories falls around the challenge to objectivity that we often have. That you can only be objective if a white person, say for instance, in a court system, a Black judge is dealing with an issue or case that is involved a Black accused, that judge or lawyer perhaps will be seen not to be objective because they are Black and they're dealing with a case that involves a Black suspect or Black accused person. But if you're white, you're going to be seen as being objective, and the work of Derek Bell also points to that idea on racial standing. Where do people stand from a racial standing perspective? That if you're Black, you're more likely to be seen as not being objective when you're dealing with issues challenging Black, suppression of Black, or anything that's going to be dealing with a Black person. But if you're white, you're going to be seen objective to be able to handle cases both from a white perspective, a white person suspect, and a Black suspect as well. And another theme, the fundamental theme that bind critical race theories together is this idea challenge to meritocracy. The idea that when we work hard in society, we are more likely to succeed. But we know that sometimes it's not about the effort and hard work you put in terms of the rewards that we get into society. Race always sometimes play a part into the accesses that you have and things that you have access to within society. Another challenge, fundamental theme, is the challenge to formal equality. Now let's just change the laws. When we change the laws, we are going to be able to see treating everybody equal. But we all know that if you think about the history of slavery, for instance, both in Canada and the United States, where we have slavery being practiced here in Canada for more than 200 years. So from that 200-year period, well, Black people were being suppressed, denied access to a number of opportunities, including owning businesses within our own society. Others were moving ahead. And so 200 years back, that's when your progress started. So we can see if you're running a race of 100 meter and you have somebody who had 50 meter ahead of you, how likely are you that you're gonna be able to catch on with that person? So sometimes it's not just changing laws and treating people equally. We have to look at equitable approach to treating individuals within our society to level the playing field. Also challenge the idea of color blindness and neutrality within our own society. Color blindness in the sense that I don't see color. Those are things that you generally tend to hear. Of course, you don't see color when you're dealing with somebody that you know you have passional connection to and so on. But that's not what people are talking about when we talk about not seeing color and so on. By seeing color, if you use color You use the skin color of somebody to help you identify whether the person is a threat or not. If you attribute criminality and violence to somebody that looks like black, and you telling me that you don't see color when you're responding to that, that is a challenge that critical race theorists don't agree with us. You know, you see color. We want people to see color, because if we do see color, we are going to be able to challenge some of those practices and policies, systemic practices that have that continues to disadvantage people of color within our society, including Black people. So next slide, please. So how do counter storytelling challenges the Mediterranean narrative that we have within society that tells us others are inferior within society, that tells us that, the poverty that others experience in society is just because they don't want to work hard. It's because they're lazy and all those things. When we don't look at history, we tend to remember historical things that we see as less controversial, if you think about it, and so on. We remember that Canada, for instance, is founded on the principles of freedom and so on, but we don't remember that as part of that freedom, to claim that Canada is founded on the principles of freedom, that there are others' right to ownership of this land, that they were oppressed as part of that separation, that others we use as laborers to produce what we have today as Canada. So we do remember those things, but we don't want to remember the other aspects that we don't see as something that's gonna create a picture of what Canada isn't about today. And so I'm gonna talk a little bit about it. So counter storytelling allows for us to hear stories from the other perspective of those individuals whose stories have been oppressed and suppressed for a very long time. So I wanted to point, next slide, please. Oh, sorry. I wanted to point out maybe you are on the history of Africa with executive producers. Okay, so I wanted to point to three examples of programs that are currently being aired. So BBC, the first one is an African history with the executive producer Zainab Bahwadi. That this program is sponsored by UNESCO that explore the history of Africa from the perspective of Africans, that talks about the origin of Africans from slavery, the experiences with slavery, resistance, and liberation to the present. And so when you hear a thing, somebody will say that, we have the Europeans going, British and other European come, Belgium, the Netherlands, going to Africa, for instance, Sierra Leone, for instance, to rescue the Africans from their barbaric practices and so on. We know that when you watch this program, it will tell you a different story, that people fought for their liberation. People knew the land was theirs and fought for their freedoms and so on. And so we can see, so that is a different history that we didn't know about before. Even Africans themselves are not aware of some of those histories, because the history that we know about African today is quite different from the actual. So this program explored the history of Africa from African perspective today. So you may want to watch that. A second story that I wanted to talk about, this is a recent program that started airing as part of the Black History Month. Actually, this talk was supposed to be part of the Black History Month talk. The BLK, an original story by executive producer producers Jenny Holness and Subs Sutherland, that explore the history of Black peoples from within Canada from the 1700s to today, from Nova Scotia, Quebec, British Columbia, and Ontario. That's another show that provide us with a different counter narrative of what Black people have been in this country, dating back to the 1700s in Canada, and we can see the experiences as well there. Next slide, please. Okay. So bringing it more local to the province of Alberta, this is another virtual exhibit of Black presence in the province, in this province of Alberta, an initiative by the Edmonton Heritage Council. We raise a Black presence in Alberta from the 1800s to the 1970s by Dr. Jennifer Kelly. That's another exhibit that you can access online to see the history of Black people here, to see that discrimination and separation, segregation, those are all practices. There were very alive practices within the province of Alberta as well. Next slide, please. When we look at in that, so those are some another story that traces the work of Cheryl Fargo, traces a less known history or distorted history of a Black cowboy who settled in Alberta in the 1900s, and that is specific within the southern province. And so if I was told that a Black person had lived in Brooks, for instance, in the 1700s, I would say no. Actually, John Ware was mentioned to me by one of my colleagues at the college when I started back there in 2015. And so, have you heard about this cowboy? Even the name of cowboy itself, that is not associated today with Blackness. When you think about Black people in the past, used to be considered as boys, no matter how old they were. And so they are the ones that tend to those animals. They're the ones. So now, but today, when you hear the word cowboy, it's not one that is shared with a Black person. It's not ranching is not something that you will share with a Black person today. But history tells us that they are foundational to the word itself, Black cowboy or cowboy for instance. In that is they are shared to Black people tending to cows and some of those animals in the ranches. Next slide, please. And so when we look at all those series, from an international perspective, worldwide perspective of the experiences of the history of Africa, exploring the different continents of Africa, we look at the experiences of Black people within a Canadian context and so on, where we can see the experience of Black people from an Alberta perspective, and we can also see the experiences of Blackness, what it means to be a Black person within Alberta in the southern parts of this country. And so we can see the importance of stories, of counter narrative, that well, before then, you will see the history of Black people in Canada. It's recent. They are all immigrants from warring countries seeking a fortune in this province. Their contribution towards the development of Canada and the province of Alberta and southern Alberta specifically is not known. It's not one that you will learn from the history books, either from high schools to post-secondary schools, prior to some of these stories coming up today. And so Bell he's considered the father of critical race theory because he's one of the initial person that started challenging the influence of race, the intersection of race and within the laws and society. So for him, stories provide an insight into the lived experiences of marginalized peoples within society. When you watch those shows, it will give you an idea what it means to be a Black person in the 1700s. It will give you an idea I am from Sierra Leone. I knew about the first set, we refer to them the first settlers, the loyalists that fought alongside the British Army back during the 1700s. They were shipped from Nova Scotia to Sierra Leone. So I always question, if Canada was welcoming to Black people, why would those settlers wanted to be shipped to Africa, to be shipped to a place where they don't know? Most of them were born in the States, I would say. And so we have a group of second settlers, we call them in Sierra Leone, the Maroons today. Those are a group of individuals identified themselves as the Creoles within Sierra Leone. But the Maroons were shipped from Jamaica, shipped to Nova Scotia as a form of punishment, and then later on shipped to Sierra Leone. And so you ask the question, why did they wanted to be shipped there if Canada was welcoming to Black people and so on? So, but we know now from the series BLK, the original story, that Canada wasn't welcome to those individuals that look Black, that we could identify today as Black people. And so through those counter stories that we are gonna be able to see to understand that Canada is not as welcome as we thought. Next slide, please. Another critical race theorist that, Richard Delgado, he also talks about the importance of a story. That story brings people with shared experiences together. Because when people talk about their experiences, whether with racism or racial discrimination and so on, it tends to be seen as isolated, or it's just that one incident, or it's just this area. But when people start sharing stories and people start hearing different stories of experiences similar to what they've experienced from different areas, people can make those connections. And then we can see those stories as being data, not just anecdote, as we often perceive within society. So counter-narrative are effective from Del Carlo's perspective to destroy those taken for granted narrative of others' inferiority within society today. That when we hear some of the stories, we can know that the color of your skin determines which area of the city you're gonna live. The color of your skin determines what type of access you're gonna be living. The color of your skin determines if you are gonna be living on a reserve, as we know the history of Canada and so on. And we tend to see Canada, to accept that Canada is one, racism is a practice within Canada, or the province of Alberta in general. That would destroy the moral high standing of Canada compared to the United States. Slavery only happened in the United States, not Canada. We know now that slavery happened here for more than 200 years in Canada. So it's not, of course, it's going to be different because, so we shouldn't be seeing it from a comparative perspective, as the work of David Goldberg tells us, that we should be looking at it from a relativity perspective. We have South Africans sending somebody before the apartheid system, sent officials here in Canada to see how Canada is dealing with Indigenous people, and went back to South Africa and implemented apartheid system. Of course, we know the treatment of Indigenous people here was also influenced by what was going on, reformatory practices within the United States, and those practices were implemented. So whatever thing we do, it's going to be the Canadian style, not the US style. So it's a relative. We should be seeing things from a relative perspective and not from a comparative perspective. Last slide, please. I think so when you think about all these stories and so on, so the stories that we tell ourselves, if we see Canada as a benevolent country, we see ourselves as, if you identify as a white person, your ancestors came to this land and saved the Indigenous peoples and so on, opened the country today to Black peoples coming from different warring countries as a way of settling to give them a better life and so on. So of course, you're heroes. And you can see, and most of the time, those heroes, the founders of this land, tend to be primarily men. Women tend to disappear. So critical race theory from an intersectional perspective asks us to question those patriarchy within our society when we talk about the founders and so on, that each and every person's story matters in this concept, that Black people also play a part towards, if we say, founding. Of course, we know this land belonged to Indigenous peoples. And when you see the UNESCO program on the history of Africa, you watch those, about 15 episodes of them, you can see the similarities to what Indigenous peoples experience here to those of other Africans in a relative different way. But that's another conversation for some time else. Next slide, please. Thank you. Thanks for this opportunity, and I'll open the floor now for questions, I believe.
Well, thank you very much for your talk. Very informative. I would like to ask the first question, the moderator's, prerogative.
Sure.
You talked a little bit about intersectionality. How about also intersectionality within race? So being a woman or a Black woman or a Black lesbian woman, how does that then impact even further your experiences? And how do those experiences intersect with each other?
Mm-hmm. Yes, definitely intersectional, and that's the most important thing, because when we think about the civil rights movements, for instance, civil rights movements focus on equal access to those institutions, education, laws, and some of those areas. And so one of the reasons why Crenshaw proposes this idea of intersectionality was that to draw attention so that although race play a factor in the experiences of Black people in the United States, but by focusing only on those experiences that are informed by the skin color, which Blackness as a race, we are gonna ignore, and that will allow us to ignore the experiences of Black women of violence within the Black communities as well. So taking an intersectional approach will tell us that when we look at the experiences of subordination and oppression within society, we can see race. We can also see how gender, being in a patriarchal society, where being a man gives you opportunity, gives you access to certain things, so on. So for Black male, would have access. We're going to experience oppression from a racial perspective. But in terms of gender, because we are in a patriarchal society, gender gives them opportunity that Black women don't experience. Class also play a part. Immigration status also plays a part here. That if you're poor, Black, and a woman, your experience is going to be different from a poor Black male, and so on. If you are somebody that has an immigration status, where a permanent resident, for instance, and somebody that is not a permanent resident, we can also see that your experience being having status in Canada gonna give you that, even though you are a female and so on. So intersectionality allow us to see our position, for us to recognize our positions, the privilege that we experience based on where we find ourselves, either from a gender perspective or class, or that is not just related to race or sexual orientation and so on. So if you are somebody that is a Black person, Black woman, identified and in a same-sex relationship, that too gonna impact your status within that group. And so when we look at it from an intersectional perspective, we can see that oppression, people experience oppression from a different angle based on their sexual orientation, based on their gender, based on their class, and so on, and some based on their ability, if they're physically limited, and so on. All those things play a part. And so when we look at it from an intersectional perspective, it helps us to locate how people experience oppression in a different ways, based on those attributes.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Knut Peterson. Many thanks for your talk, Ibrahim. Obviously, stories told by lived experience are most powerful. What are your thoughts on white people teaching Black history?
We can take it. For me, I see that if you can teach, if you're white, you can teach about Black people's experiences. How do I do that? Hey, I can bring in. So if I'm a white person, if I'm a white person, that's a good thing to open with. So here, when I go to Sierra Leone, I'm gonna be a white person. So whiteness, when we use whiteness, sometimes it's not about just the color. It is a way of being. You can be seen. I will be seen as a white person when I go to Sierra Leone because of a way of being, not the skin color. But if I'm in Canada, identify as a white person teaching something about black people, of course, the best practice to do is inviting somebody from a Black community with lived experience, perhaps to talk about. You can talk about theory, part of what that experience is. You can talk about history, but here is somebody from the community that have had lived experiences on those things, can talk about them. You can, so the same goes to everything else. Any topic that you're talking about in relation to marginalization within society and so on, that we do have access to people today who are willing to share their own experiences, that you can bring in as lived experience experts to talk about their experiences within the classroom. It's better than not teaching or talking about it at all. Right? It's better than not teaching and talking about it at all. And you're not claiming to have knowledge on those things. I would stand here and say I don't claim to know. I'm not speaking about Black people, but doing so as well, it's it's not right. It's not gonna be something that is completely accurate. And so because when what I say and what I do impact Black people, that is not just limited. The impact is not just limited to me, but all of them. So it's better than not teaching anything. You can teach it and invite others with lived experience to talk about those things that you are talking about in your classrooms.
Our next question comes from Terry Shillington. What is one or two significant changes that we could make first of all that would help towards better racial tolerance, acceptance, and opportunity?
I think fear tends to come from non-knowing people, right? It's interesting to see how our folks that are back home, that when you bring your old age relative here to visit you, would want to stay in this country for a month or two and started saying, I want to go back, because we tend to be isolated. We tend to live, you don't know your next door neighbor, or you see them and just say hi. If at all, you're saying hi to each other. So I think the first step is trying to know people, trying to know who those people are. If you're scared of somebody, maybe it's because we've attached a number of different things on the skin color, on the physical structure of people, and so on. And so your reaction to fearing them may not be something that you consciously know about, but it's something that you've been exposed to within society and so on. So the first thing is to be open to know people, trying to know what are the values of people, and those things that are the ones that you don't feel comfortable with. Ask yourself why you're not comfortable with them, and so on, and try to see if you can establish knowledge of who those people are, and start from there. We need to talk about race. We need to acknowledge the histories of people, how our history is. We experience history from a different perspective, and so on. That we need to acknowledge those stories, and we need to take a look at our, institutions, and see who are overrepresented within those institutions, and ask the questions why. Is it just laziness? Is it just criminality? Is it something? And so those are some of the things that we have to look around ourselves, to see, encourage those different perspectives, bringing people from different perspectives to be in our own places. When we say being in the table may not be just as a token, but actually when you have people of a diverse background, whether racial background, gender, or sexuality, or anything, that you not just have them there as part of to fill a quota or something, but actually listening and paying attention to what a unique contribution that they also bring into that forum and discussion, and use it to inform part of your decision-making process. We have to make conscious decision to actually include others. And sometimes, so part of that inclusion means that others should be willing to give up those positions that they are in, because that's how we can have that. So until we are willing to give up even our own position so that we can include others, I think we're not gonna be able to get there. But if we have to have that willingness to give up the privileges that we enjoy within society that we may not even be aware of, to include others within our own mix.
Are some of our larger institutions and smaller institutions, I'm thinking of maybe police or government, or that exhibit systematic racism in the way that they deal with the public, and when they get challenged on that, it's often, oh yeah, we just need to do more training. How do you feel about that? Given that there's been training galore, and the issues never seem to change at all. So how do you feel about this whole notion of, or this answer of, oh, we just need to provide more training?
Training is one. Well, training is important, but for me, it's the attitude, right? And so we live in an attitude. It's something that hides behind waiting for that perfect opportunity to show. If you think about it, if you look at, if we look at the experience of Black people in the United States prior to the Obama presidency, and when you pay attention closely to the number of Black people that were killed in the United States before and during Obama's presidency, you can see how a message was being sent to Obama that even though you are a president, that doesn't mean that Black people are within the same square root and so on in their own experience. So that is because attitude was coming out. So it's not about the training. We can do training, we can do all those things, but if the attitude that this person is inferior to you, to the work that you do, and so we're not in the same class. If you have the attitude as part of that attitude that we've seen slavery was justified by Black people being barbaric, being savage, and so on, for the violence and so on. So all the experiences that we are doing them good in providing food for them, even though we're getting them to work in plantation endlessly and so on. So those attitudes are still there. So until we are willing to change those attitudes, work on those attitudes, consciously work on those attitudes, that when you see a Black person, you perceive them to be your action, how you react to them because of that attitude of them being violent and so on, or being inferior. It's not gonna change, right? So we can do training, but I think we need to do more in terms of talking about this, having a forum like this to talk about some of these issues, inviting people from the community to talk about their own experiences and actually use those experiences not as a way of people trying to get a free pass, but really to improve the practices that we have within our own communities and so on. Bring in people from the community who may look like the people that they're going to be interacting with and so on. And so it's important that, when you see, if I am a Black person dealing with, when I see a Black person, threat is not the first thing that comes to mind to me. Threat is not the first thing that come to mind as you are threat. It's not the first thing that come to mind because it's not something that I associated with the skin color being a threat, skin color being a criminal and so on. So we can do training, but I think we need to work on the attitude. And that is not just what we say in a public. It is something that we can work on, even things that we say in our houses. Having kids, raising kids, and seeing how kids interact within schools today. For me, I think as parents, we can learn from our kids. Those that the ones that we haven't contaminated yet in talking about those negative attitudes around them. But we can see how kids interact. So when a kid tells me they don't see race, I can really believe that, yeah, they don't see race. Or if they do see those differences based on the skin color, kids would ask. They will ask questions. They're gonna touch the skin to see if the color would on their fingers and so those are some of the things we need to work on the attitude to change those attitudes, and then we can see those training that when we're saying it in the public, it's not just saying it in the public. We actually meant to change the culture of our organizations, how we train people, the language that we use as part of that training, and so on. So part of my research, looking at the cases on racial profiling, for instance, and where people that experience from marginalized Black people are saying racial profiling, police perhaps may see it as criminal profiling, but the ones that we identify as criminal tend to be associated with a skin color, with something. And so is this different semantic? One is saying racial profiling, another person is saying criminal profiling, and so on. So we don't get there, right? And if we look at the idea of, if it looks like and perception is important. For us, perception is important for us to pay attention to those, that it's not what you think you're doing, it's how people perceive and how people interpret it. Should also matters in this conversation. So we can train, but I think we need to work on the attitudes as well.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Beth Etherstone. Thanks so much. Are you aware of any research on living libraries where people tell their stories to youth and that impact on changing stereotypes of color, gender, and age?
There's a number of, I think one thing that comes to mind, Northwest College, I think they call it living library or so, where you have people share their stories. In Lethbridge College, we've been doing this part of our Black History Month celebration. We call it a human library. I'm one of those participants that usually participate in that. And this year we had two other students who are presently the president-elect of the Lethbridge College Students Association as well, and the VP on there. So for people to share their own experiences, my research is focused on the interactions of Black youth and police within southern Alberta and so on. Those are all attempts for me, making those attempts to collect stories from Black youth, to talk about their experiences. And those experiences don't really necessarily need to be negative experiences. It can very well be positive experiences. And so for those youth, for them to have the opportunity to identify those things that they can associate as something, interactions or experiences that are positive, for others to see, these are some of the experiences that youth are identifying as positive interactions. These are what the experiences that they are identifying as experiences that are negative experiences. And so that's where my research focus. I'm trying to research on those areas to get those stories, and perhaps those stories can help our organizations, and not just law enforcement organization, but even schools, right? Even schools to have those experiences and have contents that reflect these identities of the students that we have.
Our next question comes from Laurie Schultz. Sorry, Laurie, we're just slowly going through the queue here. Does the Alberta school curriculum in K to grade 12 cover racism and related issues?
Well, yeah, I'm not sure how the school curriculum is, but I know I have a son in grade 10 and grade 8. I know teachers are making effort. Teachers are including materials that allow kids to talk about. From my kids come home and talk about the things that they're talking about in school and so on. So from that end, they are engaging. Teachers here in Lethbridge are engaging in some of those conversations. Some of them, this talking about these things are new to them, because they those are not things that they've learned from their days when they were in the same school, or they were using some material that presents a different narrative from what we know today about those histories. So I'm not fully familiar with the curriculum per se of the province as a whole, but I know individual teachers, and the more Black teachers and teachers of color that we have in our schools, the better too, because those people will bring in different perspective on the material that they present in their schools and so on. Just as myself being an instructor, how I do present material generally needed, but then I bring in a different perspective. Experiences that I use, the examples that I use are informed from my own experience as being a black male in this province. And so, yeah, teachers are making effort. Teachers are making effort to introduce different perspectives and having those conversations in their school, at least from what I've seen from my own kids.
Beth Mundell Atherstone has a follow-up question to Laurie's question. Does the UCP proposed curriculum include issues of racism? I'm not sure if you know that.
Yeah, no, I don't. I'm not aware of that so far.
Okay. Our next question, again from Beth Mundell Atherstone. Local groups like the Southern Alberta Ethnic Association showcase various national cultures, foods, dances, etc. What wider role could they play in countering racism?
It does play a role. It does play a role. It introduces people to something different, that's something they may not be aware of. It shows the value of people, the values that people have coming from different places. It also shows the similarities that people have and the connections that could be made as a result of the dance, the food, and so on. So, for instance, we did actually this exercise on preparing jollof rice as part of the Black History Month. And you can see the variety of that dish, within the West African context. And we have also countries from East Africa, Kenya, that also prepare similar food, but call it in a different way. So I think it's not just important for non-people of color, but also it's important for people of color themselves, for them to be able to see the connections that prior to the scramble and partition of Africa, that countries that we see in today as different countries, more than 50 countries in today, used to be formed. They used to be in formation of kingdoms. Formation of kingdom, and people travel from one kingdom to another. So we have all these interactions where we've been able to share similar cultures and practices and so on. Of course, they're not going to be the same. They are going to be different, but it shows the connection that people have, that we're not as much as different as we often thought about and so on. Even if our skin color are not the same, when we talk, we can see similarities on practices and so on. So food, it's a good practice. A good practice to bring food, have people share food, have people share their cultural practices, And it helps people of color to see the connections and not to see themselves as completely different from others.
Our next question comes from Laura Schultz. It has been reported that the exodus of people out of Ukraine are treated differently for people of color. Can you comment on that, please?
You know, it's from the work that from my work, we can see the experience of Black people. Usually, people will say, "Oh, it's just the U.S. experience," you know. But when you think about the experience of Black people, the U.S. is foundational because the history of slavery. But we also can see that if it's not race, what else? And so it doesn't matter where you find yourself, you know, as a Black person, because you can easily be identified by that skin color, right? So the experiences are not definitely going to be the same. And so when people are talking about racial discrimination, especially for Black people being treated differently because of the color of their skin, people will say, oh, it's just an excuse. Racism doesn't exist today. And something like this happened. Why are they being blocked? Why are Black people not allowed to seek safety as anybody else? The only difference that we can see is right now, people are living, walking, getting to those borders. You know, it's hard to see the class. It's hard to see the class. All you can see is that skin color different that you have. You can have access to safety, and your skin color may determine. And so when we look at immigration status too in there, that if the perception was that, oh, these people enter here illegally, they're not even legal to be here in the first place, we will allow them to cross that. So it's race is that single thing that signifies the skin color that follows these people wherever you find yourself in the world. And this is a perfect example of it. We've seen it in the United States. When Black Lives Matter protests were protesting the death of Black people there. And we saw what happened in January 6th when the White House was stormed by people that are not identified as Black. We saw the response. Even Joe Biden, when the then president-elect acknowledges that the way how law enforcement respond to dealing with rioters that are non-Black, it's different from what that response would be if it is about Black persons. So it's really hard to miss to see that skin color as something that determine the access of people that we identify as Black people today in countries outside of Africa. If I go to Sierra Leone, of course, if I experience any form of oppression and so on, it's not going to be because of my skin color. Because when I turn around, everybody around me looks the same as me in terms of skin color. Only when I speak, and the part of region, the country that I'm from, that if I speak Temne, which is my own ethnic group, my language, so ethnicities are treated to language. When I speak Temne, if it's not a Temne region, then that perhaps maybe ethnicity will play a part in my marginalization or oppression, but not the skin color. But for Black people here, we've seen in Ukraine, the only thing we can see as a common identifier there to people here and the United States and most part of the world, wherever Black people find themselves today, is that skin color. So how can we deny that? How can we deny that? Yeah.
Our next question comes from Knut Peterson. What are your thoughts on taking down statues and renaming of institutions of known racists?
It goes back to that narrative that we talked about, the narrative that we create of the founders and all those things. So some people, you may see those statues as, you know, it shows the heroes that play a part towards the finding of these institutions and so on. To others, it may be seen as statues of oppression from the perspective that every day that I see those things are a constant reminder to remind me of my inferior status and so on. From somebody that is an educator, as I see myself as an educator, in the sense, if we build a narrative on those, if you're gonna put a statue, put the correct role that that person plays in society, that if that person was a slave owner, put it that this person was a slave owner and these are the practices that we don't want to see repeated again, and so on. But I think Germany, the practice in Germany sets a good examples for us to see here. that, in Germany, Brian Stevenson, actually a US leading scholar, talked about this and his interest working with young people of representation in the United States, in the US prisons and so on. Talks about how the absence of those statutes, people that are linked to Nazi Germany, that you don't see their statues around Germany and so on. So, and that to acknowledge the history. So I don't, for me personally, keep those things up, put the role of that person, what they've done in society, as a reminder that we don't want to repeat the same thing again, but not as a glory to celebrate those people. That should not be the focus of those statutes. But that the focus earlier on was to celebrate, and I think that's wrong, right? And so if the focus was as a form of a celebration as heroes, it's wrong. But if it is a part of having them up there as a way let's learn from it and not to repeat, maybe we need to rewrite the things, as information that we have on them, and not as just a hero, but identify them for what things they've done within history, and so we don't repeat it again. Yeah.
Okay, we've got 4 more questions, so maybe we can spend a minute or so on each. Terry Shillington, as a grandparent of a 12-year-old, it seems to me many of our young are, in brackets and capital letters, colorblind. They are discouraged from any race comments in the classroom. What are your comments?
I think we should allow kids to have, because kids, if we look at from a social learning perspective and so on, kids can imitate the type of things that we do, the practice that we have in our homes, and the way how we talk and all those things. I think we have an opportunity to allow kids to talk about, to allow kids to be open, and to do our role as educators, to explain, to correct the history of things that we didn't know about before. So I think we should be having those discussions and allow kids to ask those questions. They can change society to the way that we want it, where we don't see color, but we're not there yet.
Laurie Schultz, extremist groups associated with white supremacy ideology were identified in the recent blockades. How does a country/community approach this? What are your thoughts?
Well, I remember what I mentioned earlier is that the idea of ideology, we remember, and that tells it, their action shows why we should be talking about these things, that people, we're talking about those and talking about, we saw the money, how much money they raised, right? Where did they get that money from? And it tells you. So racism, it's actually important that when we talk about racism or racial discrimination within a Canadian context, in the US, it's open. You know that if you're a Black person, you know how to carry yourself in certain areas. In Canada, it's very subtle that you don't see it. It's so that's that for me. That's the most dangerous one for me. I don't mind somebody having wearing a hat or identify themselves as white supremacist. When I see somebody identify him or herself as a white supremacist, I know not to get close to you, not to be in a dark place with you, something like that. But here, in the Canadian context, it's very subtle. You don't see it and so on. So it just solidify, just confirm what people have been talking about, the experiences of racial discrimination and many forms of discrimination in society. So the lesson we can learn from it is racism is real, right? Racism is real. And the skin color that you identify determine what you can and cannot do. That is actually something that we need to pay. So that's what it confirms for me, for us to pay attention and acknowledge that, yeah, people have been saying this and we are seeing it right now.
The next question comes from Knut Peterson. Canada has a long history of racism towards many people of color. Are you aware of racism between people of color as well?
Yeah, and so it's, you can see, and of course others may link it to the idea of, if you put it in the colonial context where people are separated by races and say this ethnic group is better than others. We saw it from the Hutus and Tutsis in Rwanda war there. And so because we have this tribe from a colonial perspective being, say, your tribe is better than this and so on. And so people have said, of course we have those differences. That's what I mentioned earlier too, that If I experience discrimination and so on if I am in Sierra Leone today, it's not because of the skin color. It is because of perhaps the language. The lighter your skin, the more access you have to opportunities, even within the Black community and so on. So those are also so that critical race theory from an intersectional perspective allow us to see the shades, how shades of color also impact the access that you get, even within your own society and so on. The language that you speak may also give you access to a number of privileges within a country where people look the same, right? So it give us for us to be able to ask those questions. Of course, yeah, there are discriminations, forms of discrimination existing within communities of people that share the same color.
Okay, and our last question of the day from Trevor Page. Do you believe that Canada's position on diversity is genuine or just lip service?
Honest answer is lip service. Say, for instance, we've been doing reconciliation, reading statements, and all those things. We have an opportunity here in Lethbridge. Okay, let's say we live in the biggest, close to the biggest reserve of within the Canadian context. If we truly mean to do reconciliation practices and so on, when somebody buys a land here to build a house, they pay money. Let's say we're gonna take 2% of that land purchase for somebody to build a house. Let's give it to the owners of this land as a start. 2%, right? So that let's give every single land sale within the city. 2% of that money goes to the Blood tribe because they are the owner of this lands that we call it home today. That could be a start to a meaningful reconciliation, right? And we can see the history when we look at, if you watch those 15 episodes from Zainab Bahadi, you can see the practices, experience of Africans. You can see the connections, similarities to what Indigenous peoples are experiencing today. So that's why people are calling Canada as a settler-colonial state. In those African countries, the colonialists left, but they left the foundation that continued to enrich them today. Whereas in Canada, they didn't. They stayed. And we can still see those policies today within policing, law enforcement, child welfare system, and our school system today, where the histories of others are suppressed. The history of heroism of others are promoted within our school system, right? So we need to do more actions and less much more the lip service of it.
Well, thanks very much for joining us. Thank you for your time and for your very valuable talk and information, Ibrahim. Before we end this session, do you have a take-home message for our viewers?
A take-home message for me is listening to people, value what they have to share with you. The experiences of people are not just making excuses. When you have, I myself can identify myself, I had a foundation before coming to Canada, right? That foundation helped me to be where I am today. So although we can see that experiences that people have, people come to this country in the different classes, different and so on. So the experience is gonna be different. The access to resources is gonna be different. We need to pay attention. We need to hear those people that are experiencing whatever they're experiencing, take their own stories as valid data, not just anecdote or excuses not to do things, right? It is we have to validate the experiences of others and use those to actually inform the practices and policies that we have within our societies today.
Thank you, and thank you everybody for tuning in. There's quite a few thanks in the queue. Laurie Schultz, Ibrahim, thank you for your presentation today. Beth Mendel Etherson, thanks Ibrahim. A most important issue in not only our society but in the world. And for folks watching us, I hope you join us next Thursday at the same time with Richard Phillips, the Alberta Irrigation Modernization Program. So we look forward to seeing you then.